I'm going to present you the paper we produced for the conference, which is entitled Mobilizing Ecological Processes for Herbivore Production, Farmers and Researchers Learning Together. And I would have been very happy to come to New Zealand for the first time, but this was of course not possible, but this paper finally arose 2 years ago when we attended the Farming System Design Conference in Uruguay, in Montevideo. And we had very fruitful discussions between colleagues from INRAE in France and colleagues from Universidad de la República de Uruguay and from INIA in Uruguay, and some colleagues like Walter Rossing from Wageningen University. And from these discussions, this paper emerged, and so I'm happy to present it to you today. So you already heard a lot about grazing in this conference, of course, and grazing plays a key role in reducing the external inputs required for herbivore production and in alleviating feed-food competition. This is very clear. And there's a lot of amount of knowledge, there's a vast amount of knowledge is being produced on grassland-based systems, and that are, of course, very complex systems. And in spite of this very vast amount of knowledge on complex systems, there is still limited emphasis on the understanding how to learn and to implement desirable transition benefiting from ecological processes, we think. And really my talk is on the how to in grassland-based systems. And in this context, agroecology places strong value on local knowledge and places farmers as the designer of their production system. And so engaging between researchers and farmers to generate actionable knowledge that is knowledge that specifically supports farmers' decision-making and actions allows for the fostering of agroecological innovation. This is our hypothesis. And if we think this, it implies to integrate farmers' practices, perceptions, but also farmers' values in the process. It implies to account for singularities of local production system to be transformed, and it implies to disseminate knowledge among local community and regional stakeholders. And so for this talk, we relied on a number of case studies with beef cattle, sheep, and dairy cattle in which we have been involved. And this case study took place in Uruguay or in Western Europe. And what matters is that to address this question, 3 complementarity approaches were used. And you'll see that there were sometimes we analyzed trade-offs between production and environmental goals in farm networks. Sometimes we relied on long-term system experiments, and sometimes we developed a co-innovation approach. And we think that these are 3 approaches that would benefit to be taken in a complementary way to provide benefits for grassland-based systems. So we'll not have a time to go through all the case studies in fact you can find in the paper, but I will go through 3 of them. The first one deals with sheep, and I will show you how we can analyze multi-performance and resilience in a sheep farm network and in a long-term experiment. So it's a quite classical system approach. And then we'll go to Uruguay, where I think there's a very nice example showing how it's possible to link analytical approach, system experiments, and co-innovation in a way that improves the sustainability of Uruguayan family farms. And then we'll come back to France, and with a first example where the farmers are even more at the center of the co-innovation process. And I will show you in this example how it's possible to use serious game in a local knowledge sharing perspective to renew interactions between local stakeholders. And it's an example that is based on what we did in a small PDO cheese area. So let's move to the first example with sheep. And so we start on this saying that the use of farm network data facilitates learning about the complexity of agroecosystems. we can do this using surveys that are based on long time series, and also on analyzing farms covering a gradient of pedoclimatic conditions. And this is what we did in the first example, where we analyzed 5 optimal sheep grazing systems. For sheep grassland-based system, performance can be assessed through 2 key variables: the use of concentrate feeds per ewe and per year, because it represents 64% of variable cost. So it's, of course, something very important if you want to increase the economic performance of a system to deal with this. And the second parameter is the ewe annual productivity that is directly correlated with net income. And you see from the graphs on the right side of the slide that either in upland farms or in lowland farms, we selected 5 farms where ewe productivity is relatively high compared to the amount of concentrate feed that are given to the animals. And so these farms, we consider that they are quite performing farms, and so we put the focus on these 5 farms. And I don't know if you are all familiar with geography of Europe, but we are going from Ireland with a temperate grassland with an Atlantic climate to the southeast of France, where we are raising sheep in the Mediterranean area, which is much drier. And what we did in this experiment was to relate farm strategic management to technical, economic, environmental performances and to feed food competition indicators. And these indicators were either calculated from the information we got in surveys or as outputs from an optimization model. And this was used to carry on a multi-criteria evaluation. So I will not go through all the indicators, but I'm presenting here 5 synthetic indicators to assess overall farm performance. You see again the 5 systems, and you see that the 3 systems on the first line, they use relatively few kilo of concentrates per ewe and per year. So these are the more grassland-based systems. And we assessed the performance of this system by using 5 indicators, which are in green an indicator of feed food competition, and the larger the area, the better, the lower the feed food competition. Then in blue, it's related to the non-renewable energy that is needed to operate this system. In red, we have added value per worker, and on the upper area, you have an indicator of carcass conformation and of regularity of production. And what is obvious from these 5 indicators is that grassland-based farms had the best economic and environmental performance, if we consider these 3 indicators, but it would be the same with other type of indicators. And it also limits feed food competition. But what appears is a new type of trade-off, because here you frequently have trade-offs between economic and environmental performances. And in this case, these farms meet both economic and environmental goals. But you see that the regularity of the production is the lowest for these farms. And that's why we identify a new type of trade-off, showing that optimizing economic and environmental performance in these systems does not fit with meat industry demand for regular meat production. Just if you have a look at the system on the bottom on the left, it's what we call an intensified reproduction system with 3 lambings in 2 years. It's the 3x2 system. And you see that this system is very efficient for the ewe prolificacy. And just keep in mind this system, because we'll come back on this system later in the talk. Then, using these 5 systems, we also used a bioeconomic model to explore farm resilience, and a bioeconomic farm scale optimization was used to calculate performance and to generate series of iterations based on changing values on technical and economic parameters. And this allowed testing for the consequences of 3 technical hazards, which are ewe fertility, ewe prolificacy, and lamb mortality, and also for 3 economic hazards, which were related to fluctuation in the price of lamb meat, fluctuation in the price of concentrate feed, and in energy. And thus, using this model, we had this fluctuation of these hazards, and farm performances were assessed over 3,000 iterations based on simultaneous random draws with hazards related to these 6 variables. And there were hypotheses like the normal distribution of hazards and independence of the 6 variables supporting these hazards. And we assessed resilience through the frequency of 2 successive years with net income loss that are higher a given value, and it will be 2,000 € in the forthcoming example. And of course, a resilient farm is a farm where you don't have this income loss for 2 successive years. And you see on this example, the results are here. So you have the line, the vertical line is showing what is happening with this 2,000 € criteria. And what is on the y-axis is the frequency of years where the different system will experience loss in net income that are higher than 2,000 €. And you see that in the iris systems, there is 70% of occurrence where you have these 2 successive years with such a income loss, and it's only in 12% of the farms, for example, in the transhumance system in the southeast of France. And this intensified reproduction system, 3x2, 3 lambings in 2 years, it only occurs in 6% of the trials. And it is because the 3 lambings in 2 years is less affected by hazards that are related to reproductive performance, because as you have 3 lambing periods, it allows compensation at a year scale for factors that degrade ewe productivity. And for example, it's possible to remate empty ewes. And like this, as you have several lambing periods and 7 mating periods within a year, it's possible to, if you have a ewe that remains empty, it's possible to mate her again and then to solve the problem. That's why this system is becoming more resilient. So from these 2 examples, you see that this intensified reproduction system seems to have a number of advantages. And it was also tested in a long-term experiment. So this is an experiment where there were 4 successive phases. And in the middle of the process, there was a transition to organic farming. And the first thing that was tested in this after the transition to organic farming was this reproduction intensification. So far, what I present you is results really from research, but here in this long-term experiment, you see that the stakeholders are becoming more obvious because there were some people from extension services and also some veterinary were in the advisory board of the experiment, and also the outputs from this long-term experiment were compared with outputs from commercial farms from the same area. But let's come again to see whether this intensified reproduction system is as performant under organic condition than it was under conventional conditions. And you see that the ewe annual variable productivity is high in this system. This system was compared with a more traditional system with 1 lambing per year. And you see that ewe annual productivity was higher in the accelerated reproduction system. It was 161 versus 151%. It was higher on average, but it was also more variable. And there were other type of issues, is that the type of concentrate feed per ewe was 29% higher. Ewes also faced more health issues in this intensified system, where there were more problems with digestive tracheitis and coccidia. And lamb mortality was also higher, around 18% versus only 12% in the one lambing per year system. And lamb carcass were 3% lighter. And as a consequence, gross margin per ewe was finally lower. It was only 59 versus 65 euro per ewe. And you see that the point to which I would like to take you is that while this practice was successful in conventional system, it's a practice where ewe productivity was 32% higher compared with the 4 other systems, and this system also had the highest resilience. You see that reproduction intensification in an organic sheep farm did not improve economic performance and even increase system vulnerability due to the high level of concentrate feed per ewe and higher lamb mortality. So what are the lessons from this first case study? Is first that the use of farm network data facilitates learning about the complexity of agroecosystem when you follow farms in long-term series and farms covering a gradient of pedoclimatic conditions, it's possible to investigate trade-offs and to give reference on these trade-offs. It makes it possible to identify and explain trade-offs. And with models, it's possible to explore topics that are difficult to observe in the real world, such as system resilience. But while searching for multi-performance in grassland-based system, it is essential to account for the local and system conditions that can limit the expected benefits of any management practice. That was obvious with intensification of reproduction rhythm that was very successful in conventional system and of less successful in organic farming. And thus, as we tested this in an experimental farm, in a long-term experiment, it shows that long-term experiments in experimental farms make it possible to test for innovative and risky management options that would lead to unacceptable learning costs if they had been tested in commercial farms. So now let's move to South America. And I'm taking you to the Rio de la Plata grasslands, and especially to give you some information on the Rio de la Plata cow-calf system. So this grassland covers 70 billion of hectares in 3 countries, Argentina, the south of Brazil, and most Uruguay. These are humid subtropical grasslands, and the low herbage coast is the basis of meat international competitiveness. These are mostly family farms, and these farms suffer from unsustainable economic performance and degradation of this natural grassland, mainly due to overgrazing. And what's going on? Usually you see that you have very high stocking density on this grassland, and it leads to grassland degradation with finally low leaf area per meter square, low forage productivity, and this leads to a higher increase. This leads to an increased risk of erosion, to a reduced carbon sequestration in the soil, so degradation of ecosystem services. And of course, it also influences animal production because it brings an imbalance between feed offer and animal requirements. And the consequence is that cows have poor body condition score at calving. It increases the length of postpartum anostrus, the reproduction comes later. And at the system scale, it can decrease cow fertility and it can decrease calf weaning rate and thus meat production per hectare. And of course, with a high stocking density, you also have higher greenhouse gas emissions. And the idea is really in this system to decrease stocking density to improve both the economic results and maintain ecosystem services. And in this system, finally manipulating herbage allowance will be key for achieving optimal body condition scores of cows at calving. This is the theoretical framework that is expressed on this slide. You can see on the top that they have calculated body condition score targets for multiparous cows and primiparous cows. The primiparous cows are in red and the multiparous cows in blue. And you see that the shape follow the same trends. And they have also defined targeted forage age. And you see that by decreasing stocking density, it leads to higher herbage allowance from spring, when calving occurs, to weaning in autumn. And what's going on is that if you provide a higher herbage allowance in spring, body condition score increase after calving, and this shorten cow postpartum anastrus, and it will finally improve pregnancy rates because cows are at a better condition. And this benefits calf weight, and the consequences is that calves can be weaned earlier and at a higher weight. And altogether, this increases farm economic outputs and ecosystem services due to better soil cover and a higher structural heterogeneity. What I find really interesting in this example is that it shows that it's entirely relevant to integrate knowledge from animal physiology to optimize this management. What you see on the slide, you see this calf with a nose plate, and this nose plate prevents the calf to suckle his mother. And it was shown by this researcher that if you prevent the calf to suckle his mother, 2 months after the birth, it will reduce the milk production by the cow. And at the same time, it's also possible to provide a supplementation with rice to the cows. And these two phenomena together will bring the cows in better metabolic status and improve the energy balance of the cow. If you collect blood sample, you will see that it will increase insulin-like growth factor 1 and also plasma insulin. And altogether, you redirect the energy toward reproductive function. And it's possible then to limit the anastrus duration. And thus, academic knowledge on energy balance and metabolic changes associated with suckling restriction and flushing are thus fully relevant to define when and how suckling restriction should occur. And outputs of this research makes it possible to define optimal body condition score targets that make manipulation of herbage allowance successful for improving cow reproductive performance. So you see that this research that was carried out on experimental farms revealed that there's a range of options for grassland and herd management that exist and that can contribute to improve the sustainability of a cow-calf system. But the problem is that though this option represents potentially powerful levers, uptakes of these findings has been relatively slow to the farmers, and maybe because the farmers thought they were made not locally salient. And to solve this, a multidisciplinary team of researchers, advisors, and cow-calf family farmers work closely together for 3 years to improve system sustainability through co-innovation. So what is co-innovation? Co-innovation is a framework that has 3 interrelated domains, I would say. Co-innovation relies on a system approach, which allows to analyze emergent behavior of a system, to account for feedbacks, and to propose adaptive management of a system. It also relies on a reflexive monitoring of the system to analyze, to see how the system is evolving when you change the practices. And it strongly relies on social learning, where perception of other ideas matters. And it's also based on actor networks. And it aims at producing actionable knowledge that specifically supports stakeholder decision-making and consequent action. And in this case, it's made through learning cycles. And in these learning cycles, you have successive analysis-oriented research steps and design-oriented research steps that are interconnected. And if you see what's going on in these learning cycles, first you describe what's going on in the system, and then you try to explain why what you observe is going on, and then you explore some innovation. And once a bright idea has been implemented, you see the result, and again you observe the system, you try to explain why there were changes that occurred, and then explore another options. That's why they call them learning cycles. And a new cycle begins once a change in management has been implemented. So what were the redesign directions that were taken in these experiments? The proposal for redesign were based on change in management practice without adding external inputs, because they really want to rely on grass and in order not to increase costs. And what they also did not want was to increase workload. And finally, by the discussion between researchers and farmers, they define 11 ecological intensification technologies that were either related to the manipulation of herbage allowance. This came out from the previous research I mentioned, the previous results I mentioned, and this led them to adjust stocking rates and to adjust sheep to cattle ratio, also to allocate paddocks according to forage availability and animal requirements. And the other type of, and there were others related to this, and other type of ecological intensification technology were related to herd reproductive performance and target body condition score. There were early calf weaning so that cows can recover body condition, mating periods that were concentrated during summer, diagnosis of co-pregnancy during autumn, checking bull fertility 2 months before mating period. So there were a total of 11 technologies that were finally quite simple, but that were here used in combination. And this is an example, this is one of the results, which is standing biomass along the 3 years of a process and in the 7 farms. And you see that you have this fluctuation of standing biomass due to a reduction of stocking density. And overall standing biomass increased. We moved from a situation where the grass were always very short to a situation where you can have grass surplus, and it allows cows to recover more rapidly after calving periods. And overall, there was an adoption of the 11 technology that raised from 39 to 97% during the 3 years of a process. And if we show you some example of the consequences to show you that it worked, we have some examples related to production. The meat productivity increased by 23%, the farm net income increased by 56%, and native grassland biomass increased by 60%, and it had positive environmental consequences, and the ecosystem integrity and bird abundance and species richness and soil organic matter content were maintained and sometimes increased. And it also has some social benefits because not only workload did not increase, but it was even reduced by 25%. Really, there was a shift from not planning to planning in the long term, and also the farmers who were involved in this network mentioned also a number of indirect benefits from this networking, like an increase of solidarity and support between farmers that were part of a network and exchange in the knowledge they had from their own farms. So there were also very indirect social benefits. So what did we learn from these case studies? That we learned that in long-term system experiments, it allows integrating knowledge on animal physiology and plant and grassland ecology in the system redesign process. and the implementation of a current set of ecological intensification practices jointly designed by farmers and researchers in a co-innovation approach improved all the three dimensions of a sustainability of a co-cal system through successive learning cycles without increasing workload and without changing the socioeconomic context. And the result of this experiment and the way of working was also taken as a guide by extension services to scale up the ecological intensification of livestock production on native grasslands. And this co-innovation approach was finally adopted in projects involving 120 livestock farms and covering 50,000 hectares. And now I'll take you back to France, and you know that we are very proud of our cheese. And I'm just presenting you a very small PDO cheese area you probably don't know, and it's an area that is called Fourme de Mont in the Fourme de Montbrison. It's in the center of France. And this cheese is slightly blue cheese, and it's a very short, it's a small PDO. There are only 69 dairy farms, and either they make cheese on their farm or they collect the milk to make cheese in 4 dairies. So it's a very small PDO cheese. But this group was in trouble when my colleagues from INRAE started working with them, because at the origin, there was a request of a newly elected PDO board to address recurring problems, which were the low participation of PDO members in the meeting, long-lasting tensions between industrial dairies and dairy farmers, and threats on this small PDO cheese, as this cheese is very little known by consumers, and many farmers were not able to provide the added value of their milk because they had finally to sell milk directly, while the added value for farmers is much higher when the milk is marketed in the form of cheese. So there was a clear incentive to, a clear motivation of a group to produce less milk and to sell more cheese. And the objective was to make a collective perspective to develop a new project for this PDO area for the next 10 years, while motivating local stakeholders that were poorly motivated at the start of the process. And in this case, knowledge sharing was the framework that was used to support the group by increasing the motivation of farmers and of other local stakeholders to participate in decision making. And so there was a strong emphasis on the social learning dimension of the co-innovation process I presented earlier. And what is specific to this action is that serious games were used to facilitate interactions between the players and between local stakeholders, and also to understand, and sometimes to understand stakeholder representation, and sometimes as a way to make this representation changing so that they can reach a common goal. So again, it's a long process. This time, the initial process lasted for 1 year, and it was centered on the game phase. So first, they were sharing of a support process. There were also collection of information. So farmers were clearly made aware of what will happen in the next few months, and they were started to be interviewed to express their concern, and there were also 300 consumer surveys that were conducted in their area to provide a clear view to the farmers of the perception of their cheese by consumers. And then there was this day with exchange of debate where about 90 people were there, 40 farmers, the 4 dairies, and other local stakeholders. And they played these different games to interact and to try to find solution together. And then there was a decision phase that was based, there were online surveys that were sent to the different people who participate to this day, and they had to rank options that had been proposed in the games. And then there was the development of a 10-year strategy by the PDO board, and then the PDO board shared the strategy, which was a way to increase the collective vision of the strategy. And there was approval finally of the strategy during the PDO General Assembly. And why in this case, and why in other cases is it interesting to play serious games? And really the idea of playing games is to reach out people who are traditionally excluded from scientific knowledge. And for example, some farmers who have very good knowledge of their farm conditions and a very good knowledge of local conditions do not always feel concerned, legitimized, and or even competent to contribute to their sector governance. And this is all the more crucial to deal with this in the case of agroecology, of ecology, or of the ecologicalization of herbivore production, because if you do this, you really have to consider the local context and the local opportunities provided by the local context. And the agroecology paradigm, it's also mentioned that stakeholders' value are at the center of the process. And in their value, if you talk about the ecologicalization of herbivore production, you also have to include the relation of farmers to nature. But there's also an advantage for researchers, because some researchers are also reluctant to interact with farmers. And so Taylor and Deloe mentioned that playing games also makes it possible to deal with scientific epistemological anxiety about local knowledge, which can represent a barrier to its efficient integration in decision making. So you see that there would be benefits not only to farmers, but also to researchers. And in this case, the game that was used to a game really was created to visualize synergies and trade-off within the system. And this game is based on a synthetic representation of a livestock farming area seen as a socio-ecological system. You see it on the left side, and you see that this area is represented based on the relative proportion of grassland and cropping areas, based on the type of animals that graze these areas. And the system interacts along 5 interfaces: markets, jobs, external inputs, environmental and climate, and socio-cultural dimensions. That's why we consider it as a socio-ecological representation of a system. And this framework was created in a purely scientific arena, but it was adapted as a game, and the game was played by real people, by farmers and other local stakeholders. I'm not saying that scientists are not real people. And the advantage of this game is that it provides safe environments to express contrasted and sometimes antagonist worldviews among the players. If you play, for example, with local stakeholders, you can have farmers, you can have represented someone who is working in a dairy, and you can have representative, for example, of bird protection, of tourism information, and so on. And you can understand that on the different side of the barn, of a pentagon, they don't give the same priority, for example, to production and to the environment. And so you put people working together, and you take them to find a compromise to come to a global and a synthetic vision and a shared vision of their area. And doing this, participants share their knowledge, and they also collectively exercise their analytical skills by learning to position their own vision relative to that of other stakeholders. And this is really important. And what did we learn from this case study? There was indeed no quantification of the increase in farm technical economic performance, but there were the success of this initiative can be assessed through emerging actions of a group, because it led really to change in this area. And there was a PDO perspective that was built for the next 10 years. They all agreed to communicate to promote all PDO actors. These are the different type of cheese. Because before that, there was a strong competition between those that produce cheese on farm and those who produce cheese in dairies. And so they came to a better understanding of each other, and they agreed to communicate all together on this. And And they also decided to work on milk quality, sanitary dimension, especially during cheese transport. And there was a real dynamic of change with 30 farms switching to an all hay diet within concentrate feed, stopping silage also, re-evaluating summer pastures, which have a strong potential for biodiversity conservation, and some even moved to a local breed, which is the Ferrandez breed, and some use crossbreds. So it provided changes. And it also provided a renewal of social interaction within the PDO area by leading to a more peaceful and a more constructive dialogue. So I'm coming to the conclusion. And you see that on this slide, you have different case studies that I presented, and they are plotted along the different steps to produce actionable knowledge, describe, explain, explore, and design. And the color indicate the different approach. And you can see that system experiments allow to integrate analytical knowledge in the redesign process, which is very important for analytical researchers, but it mainly remains focused on the explain and explore steps, while in the co-innovation approach, it's possible to explore the whole spectrum from describe to the redesign of a system. And based on these two case study, it shows the diversity of co-innovation approaches. In the first case, in the Uruguay, it was directly linked to the research that was conducted in the experimental facilities, while it was not the case in the French PDO area. But in both cases, the process was a long-term process, and time is needed because time is needed to build confidence between farmers and researchers and other participants to the co-innovation process. And my last slide is to express that group learning and the structured co-innovation approach provided positive change in these grazing systems. And the conclusion of our paper is that knowledge sharing between researchers, farmers, and other stakeholders allows the use of science-based analytical approach and/or local knowledge in a systemic way and generates actionable knowledge to improve the multi-performance of herbivore farming system. But to make a step further, how can we achieve this as researchers? And we think that we should call for new type of projects where scientists become involved in ongoing efforts of stakeholders to bring about sustainability transition by providing evidence on the mechanism that simulate or hinder such transitions. And we suggest that this could be done by combining more closely farm networks, research infrastructure with long-term system experiments, and what occurs in what is being called living labs. And living labs are labs where a core group of actors have engaged with different other actors, which can also include scientists, and that provides a local and situational knowledge to the system. And we think sorry, that jointly analyzing long-term system experiments initiated by researchers and living labs could lead to promising options to combine generic and more local situational knowledge and thus foster agroecological innovation in grassland-based system. And I thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much for that, Bertrand. That was really, really interesting. Certainly, I think getting farmers to be involved with research is a really big problem that's sort of that we face at the moment. I was just wondering about the overall uptake. So I know that you've had you sort of looking at 41, was it, odd different case studies, but across your research, I'm just wondering what are some of the leading factors that prevent farmers from actually taking up research based on the information that that has been generated?
So that's a question. It's I'm not saying that they don't take anything in research, and I guess that the people around the table have different experience, and that of course sometimes it's the transfer of research can be more efficient than in other cases. Elsewhere it would be very sad for us. But what occurred in, for example, in the case study in Uruguay is that although this research, they made a lot of conference presentations showing the benefits of their system with this fluctuating herbage allowance, and finally what they observed is that if you go to the farms, if you count the technology transfer, it appeared to be quite low. And I'm not saying that it cannot happen. I'm just saying that if you manage to interact between researchers and family farmers and take advisors also in the process, normally it should be more rapid to come from what we produce in the research, in our research center, so that it becomes really innovation in the farms. So I guess you have all different experience. We all try to make research. Our research is applied, and so we want to make it providing changes in the system. And it's always a question, what do we do to make this? And I'm just saying that by promoting integration right from the beginning of a process between researchers and farmers, is likely to make the system, the adoption of this technology more efficient, and it's also likely to benefit from the knowledge of farmers that can also have a solution in their own environment, but also this could be brilliant ideas for other type of environments.
I've got a question. I'm not necessarily sure whether I can add anything. Bertrand, as usual, an excellent presentation. You went through a huge array of different experiential action-based research, which is excellent. I have a question which relates to funding agencies. I mean, funding agencies find it very difficult to fund something where they're not exactly clear what the outcome is going to be. And so often in the kind of research you're talking about, we start off with a very limited set of, in effect, hypotheses, because of the fact that we're trying to look at a learning cycle where we start off with the best of our knowledge and try to improve that knowledge through monitoring the way in which the system responds. How do we try and get funding agencies to be more accepting of the fact that when we're doing this kind of research, we are less likely to be sure about what the outcomes are going to be from the start, but more likely to get better long-term outcomes from the integration of different forms of knowledge and the different ways in which the actors play their part in different parts of the cycle?
Yes, thanks for the comment, Jan, and I fully agree with you, because it's also changed the relationship between researchers and farmers to work this way. I don't have a general conclusion on that, because really the problem is that for me, the real challenge is also to increase to benefit from the local knowledge of farmers, and to benefit from the solution that can be found locally. But we, as researchers, we also have to increase the generosity of this. We have to provide principles, we have to provide some general rules, and to see to what extent do they apply. And so there's, for me, a real challenge to combine this generic and more local knowledge in future science. And I don't have the answer on how to convince people who give the money, but just to inform you, at the moment, there's a Horizon 2021 project, European project, that are taking place. And there are several topics where really the focus is really much more on the integrating knowledge created in living labs and so on. So it changes the way we make research, but I think that people who give the money are also starting to change their view, and are also they want us to make good science, but they want us to have a science that has an impact in the real life. And it's really very clear if you go through the European, I know you're no longer in European, but in the European calls that are currently under statement, it's very clear from that. So I guess there's hope for that. But then it's a challenge to make this research in infrastructure and living labs working together. And I know that, for example, in some European projects, they worked a lot to make the group of living lab interacting together with a very clear methodology and with several loops and periods where people from different living labs meet and also have exchange between the different living labs on different type of topics. And I think that in the future, the challenge is to work in better connection between these living labs and research infrastructure. For me, it's a challenge for the future.
So just a quick follow-up, if that's okay, Anita. The question is then, in terms of the equity that sits across the stakeholder community, in the European Union Horizon 2030 or whatever it is now, are farmers paid to be involved in projects? Because, you know, historically we've expected farmers to contribute their time for free, whereas we as researchers are the ones that are getting paid to, you know, we're paid to be researchers. Are we really seeing there being an equity in terms of the ways in which remuneration and therefore feeling of value is being recognized?
What is clear is that they have to appear as real partners, and thus their structure will receive the money. Maybe it's not money directly to the farmers, but it's money for NGOs or for farmer associations that are involved. Yes, because they have to be the real partners. The problem in the living labs is that usually we talk about living labs and people say that the stakeholders have engaged and are coordinating themselves with different type of stakeholders, including researchers. But finally, if you observe this carefully, the leaders remain the researchers. And it's really a problem in the living labs, and we have to be aware of this, and this has to change. But really for the funding side, yes, the NGOs and farmer association are partners now in this type of calls and receive the money.
Thank you, Bertrand, for your great presentation. I'm really interested in this topic, as you may know. My question is around the competencies that people need to have to facilitate these kind of projects. I feel that is really an aspect that is it's quite difficult to find educational courses for people to learn more about how to actually implement these approaches, because a lot is about reacting to what is happening. You were talking about the reflexive monitoring, and that is really hard to teach because it's not a recipe. It is not steps that you can very easily do. It does need the competency of all the people involved. So how are you going about that in your projects?
Yes, thanks for the point that is highly relevant. I've been working for years on the grassland ecosystems, and I came from animal behavior. And doing this, I had to interact with people from different disciplines, people working in ecology, people working in herbivore, animal nutrition, and so on. And really, it came to, I think the most interesting research I've been involved in really came from interdisciplinary research. And for me, when I'm involved in such a project, I remain an animal behavior scientist, and I'm not a social scientist. But really, I think that if a group is well managed, we can benefit from the interdisciplinary and from interaction between scientists who are more involved in the biotechnical processes, in the ecological processes, and in social science, because it's really, from my own experience, I learned a lot from my colleagues who are social scientists. For me, there were things that were very obvious and should not be a problem. And for them, it was there was a question behind this, and the way we ask questions, for example, could influence the answer of the people. So I think I don't have any recipe for this, but really interdisciplinary is probably something that is definitely needed to have this system approach and to integrate different type of knowledge. So I don't know then how to teach it. I'm not teaching it myself. I also find, that's why I took this example. I also find that the games we played, and so I gave an example here, but there are many what people call serious games that are being used really to facilitate the interactions. And it's something very promising to facilitate interactions, because you reduce you're no longer a researcher or a farmer, you're just a player. So it reduces the asynchrony of the power that occurs within a group, because you're just a player. You're no longer a famous scientist, and the farmer who is playing is also playing like you. So we are all at the same level. And if you play the game, you have to come to compromise. And when you do this, you try to understand why the other doesn't react the same, why it doesn't put the same value on the different dimensions of a sustainability. And it's very useful. And maybe playing it as a game, you're not in the reality, it makes things becoming smoother. And people are in better condition to try to listen to each other, because you all know that usually all the questions related to livestock farming, to the future of livestock farming, to should we keep on eating as much meat and so on, usually there's an absence of dialogue. So it's always very strong position that fight against each other. And really the fact of playing makes this, in my experience, it made it easier. And also because you are in a sort of parallel world where you're no longer a farmer or researcher, you are just a player. And I think it definitely makes things easier. I gave an example, but there are many, many others where people interact like this, and especially on some conflicting issues. For example, some of my colleagues worked in the Parc des Cévennes in the south of France, and there are very big debates about how to graze the animals and how to protect nature. And some farmers just wanted to remove the big rocks and to fertilize the pastures because they wanted more grass, and the interaction with people involved in nature conservation were very hard, and they managed to make some progress. It's not, it does not solve everything, but it can be very useful in difficult situations with big conflicts between nature conservation and herbivore farming.
So what do you think the role is for the consumer in this sort of research? Do you think there is actually a place for the consumer to be involved in this kind of activity to kind of reduce the urban-rural divide, or do you think that's not really what this is about?
When we played this game in the French PDO area, we had some, there were, first we had a survey to show the farmers what consumer want from their product. We did not have real consumers playing the game, but we had, I don't know how to say this in English, it's a sort of association that promotes the cheese. It's in French, it's Compagnons de la Fourme. So you imagine that they have long dress and they try to defend the Fourme de Mont, this particular cheese. And they were very, they were involved, and they gave their view to the farmers, which were a different perspective, because their view was really focused on cheese quality. And there were, for example, the mayor of the village, and there were some other people who were less directly related to farming and that could interact this way. And in another project, we tried to also ask right from the beginning, consumer, what would represent an ideal dairy system in the future. And one of the questions that came out from this is that they usually don't accept that the calf is separated from the mother rapidly. They consider it's a welfare issue, while separating the calf late, it can also bring welfare issues. So it's a possibility to discuss these views that can be conflicting, and also to explain what we produce, for example, in science on animal welfare. And just among the consumers, I think we have to, for example, we have to make a difference. For example, on animal welfare, there are some associations who are really supporting animal welfare and want to improve animal welfare, while others just want we stop eating animals. And I think we have to work with the first ones and to avoid interaction with the second ones, because they wouldn't play the game. If you have to interact with people, we have to share a common goal.
Yeah, absolutely. Animal welfare is becoming more and more an important feature in our systems, and I think it's certainly something that farmers kind of need to get on board with before they become a really big problem.